Jake Renshaw hadn't seen another human in 4 days, which was just fine by him. That's why the sight of something sprawled on the forest floor, a thing that definitely wasn't human, stopped him dead in his tracks. For a moment, he just stood there, heart thumping against the straps of his hiking pack. The creature looked like something the local creek had coughed up after a bad dream. Gelatinous, vaguely cylindrical, with translucent skin that faintly glowed like a dying firefly. Its surface shimmered in patches, and the way it pulsed unevenly suggested it was alive barely. Jake took half a step back, his brain scrambled to make sense of it. Bear attack. No, bears don't leave glowing jelly blobs behind. A prank, not unless someone had a PhD in gross alien biology. The creature twitched, and Jake flinched, nearly tripping over a root. That's when he saw the burns. Angry blackened streaks along its body, paired with puncture wounds that oozed something thicker than blood and way too green. Whatever had done this wasn't anything Jake wanted to meet. He glanced around quickly, scanning the dense tree line for movement. Nothing. Just the usual hum of wind and distant birdsong. "All right, buddy," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than the creature. "What's the play here?" He could walk away. Easily. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't his problem. And maybe it was dangerous, infected with alien rabies, or packed with venom sacs ready to explode. But then the creature quivered again, and something like a faint, pitiful sound escaped its body. Jake exhaled sharply through his nose. He didn't know if it was guilt or sheer stupidity, but he was already kneeling beside it, pulling his pack off his shoulders. "I swear if you melt my hands off, I'm gonna regret this," he said, rummaging through his first aid kit. The burns were bad and weird. They looked almost chemical, but they didn't match anything Jake had seen in wilderness survival manuals or the ER shows he used to hate watch on rainy nights. He poured water from his canteen over the wounds to flush them out, hesitating when the liquid hissed faintly on contact. Still, the creature didn't lash out. He took that as a good sign. "You better not eat my face when you wake up," he grumbled, carefully cleaning one of the puncture wounds. It was oddly deep, like something had tried to spear it. The creature didn't respond, not that he expected it to. Its body shifted slightly, and for a second it felt heavier against the ground. Jake frowned, noticing how its density seemed to change. Carrying it was going to be a nightmare. When he finished patching it up as best he could, Jake sat back on his heels and wiped his sweaty brow. The thing was still alive, but barely. And leaving it here in the middle of nowhere meant it'd be dead by nightfall. "You're gonna make me do this, huh?" Jake said aloud, glaring at the creature like it had asked for his help. Maybe it had in its own weird, alien way. Grumbling under his breath, Jake hoisted the creature into his arms. Its weight shifted unsettlingly, like holding a bag of wet sand that couldn't make up its mind about gravity. He stumbled forward, adjusting his grip as greenish slime smeared across his flannel shirt. "This is so gross," he muttered, starting the long trek back to his cabin. "I'm officially insane, straight up lost it. They're gonna find my body out here and wonder what the hell I was thinking." The thing didn't answer, of course. It just pulsed faintly, its dim bioluminescence flickering in and out. Jake's cabin wasn't far, just a few miles. A couple of hours, maybe less if he pushed it. But every step with the alien was a struggle, not just because of its weirdly shifting weight, but because his brain wouldn't shut up. What if it was contagious? What if its injuries weren't random? What if whatever attacked it came back? "Really hope you're not radioactive," Jake muttered at one point, adjusting his grip. The creature burbled softly, and Jake almost dropped it. By the time the cabin came into view, Jake was drenched in sweat and slightly out of breath. His small, rustic retreat on the edge of the wilderness wasn't much a single-story wooden structure with a tin roof and a porch that creaked in the wind. But it was home. And now, apparently, it had a guest. Kicking the door open with his boot, Jake hauled the creature inside and dumped it onto his worn-out couch. He stood there for a moment, hands on his hips, staring at the alien like it was a particularly frustrating piece of IKEA furniture. "Well," he said finally, "welcome to Renshaw." "Don't touch anything." The creature didn't move, aside from its faint, rhythmic pulses. Jake sighed and grabbed a towel from the bathroom to wipe off his arms. His shirt was a lost cause. He paced the small space, glancing occasionally at the creature. His cabin was cluttered but efficient. Shelves lined with survival gear, a workbench piled with half-finished gadgets, and a wood stove in the corner. It wasn't exactly a sterile environment, but it'd have to do. Grabbing a blanket, Jake draped it awkwardly over the alien's jelly-like form. "All right, buddy," he said, sinking into the recliner across from the couch. "I did my part. The rest is up to you. Don't die or anything." The creature didn't respond, but its glow seemed a little steadier now, a little brighter. Jake leaned back, exhaustion catching up with him. "Great," he muttered, closing his eyes. "Now I'm a galactic EMT. Just what I needed." He didn't see the creature's glow pulse faintly in his direction, like a silent acknowledgement of what he'd done. The first thing Jake noticed was the sound. It was faint, a series of soft, warbling noises, almost like a broken radio trying to tune into a station. For a split second, he thought it might be coming from outside a coyote or some bird he didn't recognize. Then it hit him. The thing on his couch was awake. Jake shot up from the recliner so fast, he nearly tripped over the coffee table. The alien's glow had intensified, casting the dim cabin in an eerie greenish light. Its body shifted sluggishly, gelatinous folds rippling as it attempted to lift itself. The warbling grew louder, frantic, as if it had only just realized where it was, or maybe what it was near. "Whoa, hey, easy there." Jake raised his hands, palms out like he was talking down a spooked horse. "I'm not gonna hurt you, all right, just chill." The alien flailed slightly, its movements jerky and uncoordinated, as though its body didn't quite know how to function yet. One slimy appendage, if Jake could even call it, that slapped against the edge of the couch before it collapsed back down, quivering weakly. Its glow dimmed again, the warbling noises tapering off into something that sounded suspiciously like a wheeze. "Great," Jake muttered, slowly lowering his hands. "You're a drama queen on top of everything else." Tentatively, he took a step closer, crouching near the arm of the couch. Up close, the creature's injuries looked worse than they had in the woods. Sure, some of the burns were healing. Its glossy membrane seemed to knit itself back together in places, smoothing over like self-repairing plastic, but other wounds refused to close. The punctures, in particular, still leaked that viscous green fluid. Jake scratched the back of his neck, frowning. "You're trying, huh? But I don't think you've got enough juice to fix all this." The alien didn't respond, not that he expected it to. Its gaze, or whatever equivalent, it had seemed unfocused, like it was barely clinging to consciousness. Jake stood and moved to the kitchen, rummaging through a cabinet until he found a plastic cup. He filled it with water from the filter jug and returned to the couch, holding the cup out cautiously. "Here," he said. "You need this." The alien didn't move. Jake sighed, then set the cup down on the coffee table. "Okay, fine, be stubborn, see if I care." He sank back into his recliner, rubbing his temples. This was insane. He had zero clue what he was doing. For all he knew, he just brought home the intergalactic equivalent of a rabid raccoon. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that this thing, whatever it was, needed him. Or maybe he needed it. The idea was uncomfortable, so he shoved it aside. The sound of sloshing water made him look up. The alien was moving again, albeit slowly. One slimy appendage extended toward the coffee table, trembling as it hovered near the cup. Jake watched, fascinated, as the creature tapped the rim of the cup once, then twice, before withdrawing its appendage. You want me to?" Jake trailed off, then mimicked the motion, pointing at the cup himself. To his surprise, the alien mirrored him, wobbling slightly as it mimicked the gesture. It pointed at the cup again, then turned its glowing mass toward Jake. "No way," Jake whispered, sitting forward. "You get what I'm saying?" The alien didn't respond verbally, but the deliberate repetition of its gesture left no doubt. Jake felt a sudden rush of awe and, if he was being honest, a little panic. This wasn't just some animal with weird biology. It was intelligent. It understood the concept of communication, even if it didn't understand him directly. Jake leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. "Well, that's just freaking great. You're a space genius, and I'm over here trying to figure out if you can drink tap water without exploding." He grabbed the cup and brought it closer to the alien, holding it near what he assumed was its head. Or maybe its torso, hard to say. "All right, buddy, if you want it, take it, but no funny business." I've seen enough sci-fi movies to know how this goes. The alien hesitated, its glow flickering in a way that almost seemed hesitant. Then, with a trembling motion, it extended its appendage and dipped it into the water. The liquid rippled slightly, and for a moment, nothing happened. Jake was about to pull the cup away when the alien's glow brightened, just a little. It withdrew its appendage and sank back into the couch, emitting a soft, satisfied clicking noise. "Well, I'll be damned," Jake muttered, setting the cup back on the table. "You're not gonna start glowing brighter and shoot lasers, are you?" The alien clicked again, almost like it was laughing. Jake decided he didn't want to think too hard about that. For the next hour, the cabin settled into an uneasy rhythm. Jake busied himself with chores, stacking firewood, checking the solar battery on his lantern while keeping one eye on the alien at all times. It didn't move much, but its glow seemed more stable now, less flickery. Occasionally, it would emit those strange clicking noises, especially when its gaze lingered on something electronic. "You like tech, huh?" Jake said at one point, holding up the solar lantern. "This do it for you," the alien clicked rapidly, its glow pulsing faintly. Jake shook his head, half amused. "Well, don't get too attached. It's not for sale." As night fell, Jake realized he had another problem: food. He couldn't exactly whip up a bowl of spaghetti and hope for the best. For all he knew, the alien ate rocks, or sunlight, or nothing at all. Standing in the kitchen, he eyed his limited supplies. "You don't look like a steak kind of guy," he muttered, glancing toward the couch. "Or maybe you are, I don't know what's worse." He settled on a compromise, a little bit of everything. A slice of bread, a chunk of raw carrot, a strip of bacon, and because why not a spoonful of peanut butter? He arranged the meal on a plate and brought it to the coffee table. "All right, buddy," he said, sitting cross-legged on the floor. "Dinner is served, bon appetit or whatever." The alien didn't react immediately. Then, slowly, it extended an appendage toward the plate, hovering over each item as if considering its options. Jake watched in fascination as it finally chose the peanut butter, scooping it up in a way that was both graceful and deeply unsettling. "Peanut butter," Jake said, eyebrows raised. "Really? That's what does it for you?" The alien clicked softly, its glow pulsing with what Jake could only describe as contentment. "Well, I guess that's one less thing to worry about." He leaned back, stretching his legs out in front of him. "You're lucky I didn't offer you my last can of Spam." "That stuff's sacred." The alien didn't respond, but for the first time, Jake thought he saw something in its glow, a faint, almost imperceptible flicker of gratitude. It was subtle, but it was enough. "All right," Jake said, letting out a long breath. "You can stay. But only until you're strong enough to leave." "Got it," the alien clicked once, softly. Jake wasn't sure if it understood, but he felt better saying it out loud. As he watched the creature settle back onto the couch, its glow dimming to a steady, rhythmic pulse, Jake couldn't help but wonder what he'd just gotten himself into. Something told him this was just the beginning. Jake heard the rustle of movement before he saw them, 3 figures stepping out from between the trees, their silhouettes jagged like the rifles they carried. His first instinct was to drop the bundle of kindling in his arms and bolt, but common sense told him running would only make things worse. Instead, he straightened, planting his boots firmly in the dirt and adjusting his grip on the axe he'd brought for splitting wood. Not much of a weapon, but better than nothing. "Afternoon," one of the strangers called out. His voice was calm, too calm, like someone who already knew they had the upper hand. Jake nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "Afternoon." "Something I can help you with?" The man stepped closer, and Jake got a better look at him. Late 40s lean, with a kind of wiry strength that suggested he spent more time outdoors than in. His fatigues were clean but worn, blending into the forest almost too well, and his rifle hung loosely at his side in a way that was anything but casual. The 2 others flanked him, one tall, one short, both watching Jake like hawks. "We're with a wildlife research team," the man said. "Name's Harlan. We're surveying the area for, unusual activity." "Strange sightings, that sort of thing." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Wildlife research, huh? Funny, I didn't think biologists usually carried assault rifles." Harlan smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You'd be surprised what's out here. Dangerous predators, better to be prepared." Jake forced a chuckle. "Right, well, I haven't seen anything unusual, just squirrels and the occasional deer." "You're welcome to look around, though." Harlan tilted his head slightly, studying Jake like he was sizing up a deer himself. "You live alone out here?" "Yep, just me and the trees." "Closest neighbors a couple miles that way." Jake gestured vaguely toward the horizon, hoping to steer them away from the direction of his cabin. "Not much happens out here." "Peaceful, you know." Harlan didn't take the bait. He stepped closer, close enough that Jake could see the faint scars crisscrossing his knuckles. "Thing is, we've had reports of something unexplainable. A light in the sky, strange noises. You sure you haven't noticed anything?" Jake felt his jaw clench. The man's tone hadn't changed, but there was an edge to it now, sharp and probing. He thought of the creature whistle, as he'd started to call it, resting back at the cabin. The thing had barely started to recover, and now this. "Can't say I have," Jake said, keeping his voice steady. "Like I said, it's just me out here. If there were lights or noises, I'd have noticed." Harlan held his gaze for a moment too long, then glanced over his shoulder at the others. "Check the perimeter," he said. The taller of the 2 nodded and disappeared into the trees, rifle at the ready. The shorter one stayed put, his hands resting lightly on his weapon. Jake felt his pulse quicken. This wasn't a conversation anymore, it was a chess game, and Harlan was making his move. "Hope you don't mind me asking," Harlan said, eyes narrowing slightly. "You always this far from your cabin during the day?" Jake shrugged. "Firewood doesn't chop itself, and I like to stretch my legs." "Clears the head." "Fair enough," Harlan said, though his tone suggested he didn't believe a word of it. He glanced at the bundle of kindling at Jake's feet. "That all you're carrying?" "Just wood." Jake shifted his grip on the axe, forcing himself to relax his shoulders. "Unless you think I'm hiding something under my flannel, yeah." "Just wood." The tall man reappeared, shaking his head. "Nothing," he said curtly. Harlan's jaw tightened, and for a moment Jake thought he might call the bluff. Instead, he nodded and stepped back, his smile returning like a mask being slipped on. "Well, we'll let you get back to it. But if you see anything at all, you let us know, all right?" "Sure thing," Jake said, forcing himself to smile. "Good luck with your research." The three men disappeared into the trees, their footsteps muffled by the underbrush. Jake waited until the sound of their movement faded completely before letting out a shaky breath. His hands were damp with sweat, the axe handle slick beneath his grip. He hadn't realized how tightly he'd been holding it. He didn't wait long before heading back to the cabin, his pace brisk but cautious. If those guys were who he thought they were, and he had a sinking feeling they weren't just wildlife researchers, then they wouldn't give up easily. He needed a plan. When he reached the cabin, he found Whistle perched near the old transistor radio on the workbench. The alien had never shown much interest in the countless bits of junk Jake kept lying around, but now its glowing form hovered intently over the device, one of its appendages brushing the dials. "What are you doing?" Jake asked, closing the door behind him and locking it for good measure. Whistle didn't respond at first, its warbling noises faint and uneven, like static from a broken speaker. Then, as if in answer, the radio crackled to life. Jake froze as a series of tones filled the air, rising and falling in a pattern that was almost musical. The sound was eerie but not unpleasant. "Okay," Jake said slowly, stepping closer. "What the hell is this?" Whistle turned toward him, its glow flickering. It pointed one appendage at the radio, then at itself, its gestures deliberate. Jake frowned, running a hand through his hair. "Wait, are you doing that?" With your voice, the alien clicked softly, its glow brightening slightly. Jake stared at the radio as the tones shifted again, this time stretching longer and deeper. The static around them seemed to thin, and for a brief moment, Jake thought he could hear something else, a faint voice, distant and garbled. "No way," he muttered. "Are you boosting the signal?" Whistle didn't answer, but its glow remained steady, as if to confirm Jake's suspicion. He sat down heavily on the workbench stool, staring at the alien like it had just solved cold fusion with a paperclip. "You're something else, you know that," Jake said, shaking his head. "But you're also a giant pain in my ass. Those guys I saw in the woods, they're looking for you, aren't they?" Whistle's glow dimmed briefly, and Jake could have sworn it looked guilty. He leaned forward, frustration bubbling up despite himself. "Look, I don't know what you are or where you came from or why you're here, but I need to know, are you some kind of space fugitive? Did you bring trouble to my doorstep?" The alien turned away, its glow flickering erratically. Jake groaned, rubbing his temples. "Great, just great." He stood and began pacing, his mind racing. If those men came back and he couldn't risk Whistle being here. He needed to hide the alien and fast. Turning to the creature, he sighed. "All right, listen. I don't know what kind of mess you're in, but if we're gonna get through this, we need to be smart. Follow me." He led Whistle outside, careful to check his surroundings before stepping into the open. The storm shelter was concealed beneath a patch of overgrown brush near the cabin, its entrance hidden by a heavy wooden hatch. Jake hadn't used it in years, but it'd have to do. Pulling the hatch open, he gestured for Whistle to follow. "Down there. It's not glamorous, but it's safe." "I'll bring supplies." Whistle hesitated for a moment, its glow dimming before slipping into the shelter. Jake followed, lighting the cramped space with a lantern. He grabbed an old duffel bag from the corner and began stuffing it with essentials: food, water, first aid, while Whistle watched silently. When he finished, he sat back on his heels, meeting the alien's gaze. "I'm not gonna let them take you," he said firmly. But you have to trust me, all right? Whistle clicked softly, its glow steady and warm. For the first time since this whole mess began, Jake felt a flicker of hope. All right, he said, standing. Let's get to work. Jake had barely stepped outside the next morning to chop wood when he heard the unmistakable crunch of boots on gravel. His stomach tightened as he glanced toward the driveway. A black SUV idled near the tree line, its engine a low growl. The armed strangers from the day before were back, this time with more purpose. 4 of them climbed out, weapons slung casually over their shoulders, though their postures were anything but relaxed. "Mr. Renshaw," Harlan called out, his voice sharp and commanding. "We'd like to have another word." Jake sucked in a breath, setting the axe down slowly. He forced himself to keep his expression neutral as he turned to face them. "Morning," he said. "Didn't think I'd be seeing you again so soon." Harlan strode toward him, the other 3 fanning out behind him. Their eyes scanned the cabin and surrounding woods like they expected something to leap out at any moment. "We need to take a closer look at your property," Harlan said flatly. "Protocol," Jake crossed his arms, leaning on the axe handle. "Protocol for what exactly?" "I told you yesterday I haven't seen anything unusual." "We're following up on some new intel," Harlan replied, his tone clipped. "There's been an incident nearby. Hazardous material from a crash site could be dangerous. We're here to make sure you're not at risk." Jake barked a humorless laugh. "Hazardous material out here. If I knew anything about that, the first thing I'd be asking is why you're not wearing hazmat suits." One of the men behind Harlan stiffened, but Harlan held up a hand, his smile tight. "We're taking every precaution. Now, are you going to cooperate or do we need to escalate this?" Jake knew he was cornered. If he pushed back too hard, they'd start tearing his place apart and it wouldn't take long to find Whistle. He needed to stall. "Fine," he said, throwing up his hands. "Look all you want. Just don't break anything. I'm not exactly rolling in cash to replace stuff." Harlan nodded, gesturing to the others. One of them pulled a small, sleek drone from a case strapped to his back and launched it into the air with a flick of his wrist. The device buzzed to life, its camera lens swiveling toward the cabin as it began to hover low over the property. Jake's heart pounded as he watched the drone's path. It zipped toward the cabin first, scanning the exterior before heading toward the shed and woodpile. He prayed Whistle had stayed hidden in the storm shelter. The alien had been eerily quiet since Jake had stashed it there. Then, just as the drone made a sharp turn toward the back of the cabin, it sputtered. The hum of its rotors wavered, and suddenly it pitched sideways, spinning erratically before slamming into the ground with a metallic crunch. "What the hell?" one of the men muttered, jogging over to the crash site. Jake hid his relief behind a raised eyebrow. "Guess your fancy tech's not so reliable after all." Harlan shot him a sharp glance but said nothing. The man inspecting the drone knelt and flipped it over, frowning as he examined the exposed circuits. "It's fried," he said, "like something shorted it out." Harlan's jaw tightened. He turned back to Jake, his eyes narrowing. "You sure you don't know more than you're letting on?" Jake met his gaze without flinching, though his grip on the axe handle tightened. "Look, I'm a lot of things, but tech savvy isn't one of them. If I'd rigged something to take out your drone, I'd probably have ended up electrocuting myself." For a moment, the 2 men locked eyes, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Then Harlan barked an order to the others. "Search the area, thoroughly." Jake's stomach twisted as the team spread out, rifles at the ready. He was running out of options. If they got too close to the storm shelter, Whistle wouldn't stand a chance. But just as the tall man with the drone equipment started toward the brush near the shelter, a shrill, resonating sound split the air. It was high-pitched, almost mechanical, and it hit with such force that Jake instinctively clapped his hands over his ears. The men staggered, some dropping their weapons as the sound seemed to reverberate through their equipment. Sparks flew from their radios, and one of their flashlights popped in a burst of smoke. "What is that?" one of them shouted, stumbling back. Jake turned toward the source of the noise, his stomach sinking. Whistle had emerged from the brush, its glow blindingly bright as it emitted the resonating sound. Its gelatinous form pulsed with intensity, and the air around it seemed to shimmer like heat waves. "Stop! Stop!" Jake shouted, but Whistle either didn't hear him or didn't care. The strangers were already retreating, clutching their heads as their equipment failed one by one. "Fall back!" Harlan barked, his voice strained. He grabbed the nearest man by the arm, dragging him toward the SUV. Within seconds, the team had scrambled into the vehicle, slamming the doors shut. The engine roared, and the SUV tore down the gravel road, disappearing into the trees. The silence that followed was deafening. Jake lowered his hands from his ears, his heart still racing. Whistle stood motionless, its glow dimming slowly as it turned to face him. "What the hell were you thinking?" Jake snapped, his voice hoarse. "You could have gotten us both killed," Whistle clicked softly, its glow flickering in what Jake could only interpret as contrition. He groaned, raking a hand through his hair. "Damn it. You can't just do that, all right. I don't know what kind of space superpowers you've got, but you can't go blowing up people's gear every time they get too close." The alien clicked again, its tone softer this time. Jake sighed, slumping against the cabin wall. "I don't even know why I'm yelling." "You probably don't understand a word I'm saying." Whistle tilted its glowing form slightly, almost as if it were listening. Then, to Jake's surprise, it mimicked his earlier words in a distorted but recognizable version of his voice. "You can't just do that." Jake blinked, too stunned to respond. A second later, he burst out laughing, the absurdity of the situation finally catching up to him. "Oh, you are something else," he said, shaking his head. "I'm mad at you, but damn, that was impressive." Whistle clicked again, its glow pulsing in what Jake could only assume was amusement. He let out a long breath, the tension in his chest easing slightly. "All right, fine, you're off the hook. But seriously, warn me next time you're gonna pull a stunt like that." The alien clicked once more, and Jake couldn't help but chuckle. "You owe me after all this," he said, pointing a finger at it. "And by owe me, I mean don't blow up my cabin." Whistle tilted its form again, mimicking his words. "Don't blow up my cabin." Jake shook his head, grinning despite himself. "You're gonna be the death of me." Later, as the afternoon sun dipped low on the horizon, Jake packed a small bag with supplies, slinging it over one shoulder. Whistle hovered nearby, its glow steady and calm. Jake glanced down at the alien, then at the vast stretch of wilderness ahead. "Well," he said, adjusting the strap on his bag, "you've officially turned my life upside down. Guess I might as well see this through." Whistle emitted a series of soft, musical tones, pointing one appendage toward the distant hills. Jake nodded, stepping off the porch and into the unknown. As they walked, the cabin faded into the background, replaced by the endless expanse of trees and sky. Jake couldn't help but smile, despite everything. His life might have taken a turn he never could have expected, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't regret it.